I'm Allison Carter. I'm a visiting assistant professor here in the anthropology department, and I just want to thank you all for joining us today. And I'm pleased to introduce my friend and colleague Mitch Hendrickson, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Illinois in Chicago. And he actually originally did his bachelor's and master's in New World Archaeology at the University of Calgary before switching to Southeast Asia and working at the University of Sydney, where he got his PhD. And his dissertation research was on the transport and communication networks of the Angkorian Empire, and he's published on this work in journals like Antiquity and World Archaeology. But he's here today to talk about his current project, which is at the site of a frontier site of the Angkorian Empire called Preah of Kompong, Svay, where he's been investigating, among other things, iron production through his Industries of Angkor project, and then more recently on the transition to Theravada Buddhism through his Two Buddhist Towers project, which he just returned from field work in the past couple weeks, right?
Sweet.
Yeah, so he's going to be telling us about some very cutting-edge research that he's just been doing on his work in the Two Buddhist Towers, and specifically his talk today on the multidisciplinary investigation of religious and community change during the Angkorian period at Preah of Kompong, Svay. So please join me in welcoming Mitch. Turn these lights off. Is that okay?
Perfect. All right, thanks everyone for coming. It's nice to finally get down to UIUC. Haven't been down here before, and it's nice to be at the sister school of the UI campus. What I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about the Two Buddhist Towers project, which is a 2-year project that was funded through the Robert H. Ho Buddhist Family Foundation. But I'm going to start off talking about the other hat that I wear, which is for the Industries of Angkor project, which is kind of my primary research focus that I've been working at the site of Preah of Kompong, Svay, which is located in eastern Cambodia. So just to give a bit of perspective, for those of you who don't know where Cambodia is, Cambodia is situated in kind of the heartland of mainland Southeast Asia, situated between Thailand, Laos, Vietnam. The little orange blob right here is where Angkor is, and most people probably are aware of Angkor, mostly through the presence of Angkor Wat, which is the kind of heart of Cambodia in many ways. The temple itself is the single largest religious monument on earth. You can fit the Vatican inside it. And it features on the flag, and Angkorian history and culture is a really significant part of Cambodian culture. Today we probably are aware that it is a UNESCO World Heritage Site and gets up to 4 million people visiting it today. I really don't work in Angkor at all. I work outside of it, but I've been affiliated with the University of Sydney's Greater Angkor Project, where I did my PhD from about 2003 to about 2007. Just to give you a bit of scale for how big it is, this is where we are today. And that is Angkor Wat at the exact same scale. So for those of you who know the geography of downtown here on campus, so Angkor Wat it's huge. The moat itself is 200 meters wide. It's about 1 kilometer long. Allison actually excavates inside of it, and I'll show you some of the things that we've found inside a similar style enclosure out of Preah of Kompong, Svay. There's Angkor Wat in context when we talk about Greater Angkor. So that big temple that I just showed you on the last page is one temple situated within, which is referred to now as the single largest low-density settlement in the pre-industrial world. The extent of Angkor Wat is a tiny little temple in amongst a series of temples spanning from roughly the 8th century through to the 14th century. You can see the big reservoirs on either side, the East Barai and the West Barai. The West Barai is 8 kilometers long, just to give you a bit of scale and perspective. The entire kind of hydraulic complex and temple complex here covers roughly about 1,000 square kilometers. So it's about the same size as Los Angeles. And this is between the years of about 1100 and 1300 is when it reached its peak. So it is a vast megalopolis, had about 750,000 people in it. It was run by a series of kings who largely practiced in state religion, which was based on Hinduism or Brahmanical ideas and Buddhist ideology. which led to the construction of these temple complexes. And Angkor's temples are really the thing that has been the focus since the French started working there in the latter part of the 19th century. And now we're starting to see research since the end of the civil conflicts in Cambodia in the early 90s of kind of more dedicated archaeological research that is interested in things that aren't just related to the temples, but how the temples function. So in a bigger picture, if we move up a scale, this is kind of the big blob that you would see projected on the landscape of the influence that the Angkorian Khmer had by the 13th century. The famous King Jayavarman VII is seen as having expanded the empire to its maximum extent. This is actually a misnomer in terms of how much they physically controlled, but this is areas that they probably had influence over. The actual area that they controlled is probably demarcated largely within this heartland around the Tonle Sap Lake, the Dang Rec Range in northwestern Cambodia. The question that I'm specifically interested in has been what enabled the Khmer to actually create this vast empire. There's been a lot of discussion about how it fell apart. The Greater Angkor project has been focusing specifically on what factors led to its ultimate collapse. I'm interested in how it grew. So one of the ways that we can assess how it grew is to look at its kind of economic base marks. And the inscriptions, the epigraphic record, which includes about 1,300 inscriptions written in Sanskrit and Khmer, lists a lot of economic transactions, dedications to various temples. Here you can see a list of some of the products that were moved into temples. There's also Chinese accounts of what objects were sent out of Cambodia into China and also down into insular and island Southeast Asia. Now, most of this stuff, of course, we can detect archaeologically, but there are some things that we can't. Fish, rice, and salt are kind of the staples of Khmer kind of foodstuffs. We know that the Tonle Sap Lake is the largest fish bowl in Southeast Asia. 90% of the protein for the country actually is derived from this big lake. The area around the lake floods to a factor of 5 every year, creating this vast floodplain. So we have a massive amount of rice and fish which are situated in and amongst the area where Angkor is actually located. These other things here, bronze, copper, bronze, iron, etc., these things that we can actually track in the landscape are things that we don't see within the Angkorian area. However, they were extremely important for construction purposes, also for the development of their religious statuary. So what I did in my PhD was to look at this relationship of where Angkor, so you can see here the Tonle Sap Lake, which has all of the lovely fish, and then the floodplain. Essentially, if you wanted to draw a line around it here, this is the area that floods every year. So it's an ideal place for growing lots and lots of rice, which is good for supporting large populations. My PhD research on the transport system was to identify, in amongst other things, the history of it, but also why was this road system actually built. Very few states actually built formalized road systems. The Khmer are the only ones in mainland Southeast Asia who did it. And so part of the explanations for looking at it is to see what's actually at the nodes, what's at the end points of where these roads go to. Now, if we look at the northwest road connecting from Angkor to a site called Pimai, Pimai is surrounded by salt domes. There is no sources of salt in and around Angkor today. Angkor has an abundant amount of fish, and one of the staples of Khmer cuisine is fermented fish or Preah. The only way to ferment the fish properly is with salt. So the idea is that the road system here was actually established for the movement of salt and salted fish back and forth. And interestingly enough, the pass, this is a mountain range called the Dang Rec right here, which is about a 500-meter escarpment. One of those passes is called Preah, which is the Preah Road. So there is a ethno-historic indication that that was one of the commodities that was moving back and forth. If we look at the other roads, we go to the one in the northeast. Wat Pu is one of the oldest Angkorian and pre-Angkorian temple complexes. The area around it is surrounded by copper sources. Okay? So we know that copper is one of the primary metals for making bronze, in fact, the primary one. And if you go in any museum anywhere in the world, there is Khmer statuary made out of bronze. So the argument is that the flow of economic materials, the reason why they would have built such a road, not only to dedicate things to Wat Phu, was because this area has copper. There's no copper in and around Angkor at all. The question is, what is happening on this east road? And this is where we get to my site, Preah Kompong Svay. Iron is one of the most important, yet one of these weirdly things that it's actually understudied within medieval Southeast Asia. We know that the Iron Age starts in about 500 BC, but there's almost no evidence of iron production sites dating to that period. And in fact, there's very few iron production sites that have been found within kind of even the medieval period. But we know that they used iron. We find iron as architectural crampons in temples. We know that they use it for weapons and tools. We've found both in archaeological context. And we also have descriptions in the historical records of how much iron was actually needed. And this inscription was initially translated in the 1920s. And the idea of studying iron was pretty much just forgotten about, or not even addressed really, for a very long time, up until I started the Industries of Angkor project about 6 years ago. So the notion of where iron is coming from and what it enables a state to do is a primary kind of driving factor for my research. And if you look at the site of Preah Kompong Svay, all these little black triangles represent iron sources. And in fact, the largest iron source in Cambodia is situated about 20 kilometers away from it. And this is it's about 85–90% magnetite hematite. It is a veritable gold mine in iron, and today the Chinese have purchased it and are slowly destroying it to take back to China. Now, from an archaeological perspective, in terms of the role of Preah, this is the map that we just released from a colleague of mine, Damien Evans, and I have been working for years on this, trying to identify the structure of this site. It's actually the largest enclosure complex that the Khmer ever built. The walls, these external ones, are about 5 by 5 kilometers. You have a central temple complex in the middle, these large reservoirs, and a very large barai off to the east. The history of this site is really fascinating because the earliest temple there dates to the period when the Khmer started to expand in the 11th century. And then you see the important kings in the 12th and 13th centuries start to build their own monuments there. And essentially it worked like an onion. You have the first temple, then you have the second temple enclosure, third temple enclosure, and then this big fourth wall on the outside. So it's unique in terms of its size, it's unique in terms of these regional temples that are constructed by the Khmer tend to be usually very small, very constrained, and often don't have multiple phases of construction, but this one does. The other significant thing about it is that it's the only site that has evidence of iron production inside it. So that was the first sort of twig that it had some relationship with iron. That was identified in the 1880s, and no one went back until 1996, 97 to actually look to see if it's still there. In fact, there's been many more iron production sites we've identified since. The significance of Preah is not only for this size and also the fact that there's iron production in it, but the fact that this road system that connects Angkor to this site has the most infrastructure of any of the roads. Bridges are usually built on the roads, water tanks are built next to the roads, but this one actually has 2 periods of what we call rest house temples that are spaced about 12 kilometers apart. And they represent 2 different phases of kings who were placing these buildings on the roads ostensibly to control what's moving along it. So this suggests that the roadway and what's being produced at Preah is actually really significant. The size of this site is important. The orientation of the site is also something unique. Most of the temples in Cambodia are oriented to the east-west. This one is oriented to the northeast. We've now figured out that that's probably more of a hydrological construct rather than any kind of cosmological orientation. The Khmer are very good at manipulating water, so it makes sense that if you need to actually, if the water's flowing this way, you just build your things perpendicular to it to manage the water flow. The iron production inside of it makes it unique. As I said, there's no iron production in it at all. There's no iron production in or on Angkor. In fact, the only other iron production sites are located up here in Thailand, and they've recently found some over here and a few sites over here, but these ones are probably prehistoric. It is situated, of course, close to the Phnom Dike, within about 20 kilometers, so it has access to this big iron production site. The area of Phnom Dike today is also unique in that it has an ethnic minority who live around it, who made iron using traditional bloomery techniques until the 1940s. And there's chronicle evidence to suggest that they made iron for the Khmer kings dating back to the 1600s. So the ethnic minority, the Kui, may have actually had some role within the expansion of the Khmer Empire in the past. The other intriguing thing, and this is what I'm going to focus more on today, is the nature of Buddhism. The site is almost ostensibly Buddhist from its initial construction through to the end. Most of the Khmer kings dedicated their temples to Shiva or Vishnu, but each of the constructions here and all the iconography is heavily Buddhist. So the question of why did they choose Buddhist iconography as opposed to what you would see literally almost everywhere else, what was the decision-making process that led them to decorate the temples and dedicate them in that way? So when we looked at the iron production sites, trying to see if there were any more, the initial ones that we were identified were located right here, just outside of the third temple enclosure. And we identified further iron production sites along these reservoirs scattered throughout what is essentially the fourth enclosure area. 17 individual sites that have upwards of 5 to 10 small iron production mounds to them. So the question is whether or not this is actually some kind of heart of production of iron that was being supplied to the Khmer that enabled them between the 11th and 13th century to actually spread across mainland Southeast Asia. So was this actually a catalyst of imperial growth? Now, unfortunately, we did a whole bunch of radiocarbon dates of the iron production sites this is wonderful, if you cut in an iron production furnace, you get the ore, and the ore is reduced, and you're left with the iron bloom, and then the slag, the waste material, collects at the base. The slag collects everything else that's in it, including chunks of charcoal that were used from the fuel that lit the fire. So if you cut these things open, they're wonderful little stratigraphic cakes. You can actually date the time when that was actually fired. Now, if we look at the radiocarbon dates, however, we're looking for dates that should be between the 11th and the 12th century. And the cluster of dates that we have is all after that. So that kind of took my entire Lord of the Rings analogy and flushed it down the toilet. But that's science, right? We have to move forward and try to figure out what's going on here. So we have the late 13th century, but more importantly, we actually have evidence of iron production during the collapse of Angkor. So the people who are working in Angkor were actually very excited by me because suddenly I'm telling them that things were still happening when Angkor was dying. Now this may be related to issues with producing iron so they can combat the Ayutthaya forces who are moving into Angkor. We don't know, but what this says is that the site was never completely abandoned and was being used for a different purpose at another time. So the iron production story kind of changes, and the idea that I came up with then is if the iron isn't being produced here, but all of the signs within Preah and Kompong Svay indicate that it was placed there for a reason. If we look at it from a landscape perspective, we can see that Preah is actually the last big temple to the east. There's no more temples over here. They just dissipate. That's where the source of iron is. This area is ostensibly Kui territory today. Just as a side note, there's no Khmer historical reference to them actually knowing how to smelt iron. There was and in fact, going back to that 16th century reference, the Kui were the ones who smelted the sacred sword for the king when he took the crown. So the idea of the Kui actually being important back in the past is significant. We also have the fact that the Preah is situated right on the main catchment river that takes you into the Tonle Sap. So if we combine all these things together, we kind of think of, visualize of Preah as being kind of a facilitator or an outpost that may have been placed there to gain access to the iron that was being produced in that region. My other project focuses specifically on the dating of the iron production sites here, and I'll tell you there's a lot of really, really big sites there, and they date to the Angkorian period. So we know that iron was being produced in that area. So what I want to talk about today is it's this nature of why would they have actually selected Buddhism and what was going on with this Buddhism within Preah. If we look at what Buddhism actually plays in many other cultures, particularly cultures that have Hinduism and Buddhism as an interplay, specifically many of the states within South Asia, Buddhists were able to actually interact with a wide range of different groups. So a potential explanation for this is that the selection of Buddhism is that it's actually a bit more palatable for dealing with the minority groups here to facilitate sort of a trade relationship between the Angkorian Khmer and the groups who are responsible for making this very precious resource. So today what I really want to focus on is not that relationship, because we're still in the process of figuring out the chronology and the material culture exchange between the Phnom Dek region and around Preah. What I want to talk about is this shift. Now, during the collapse of the Khmer Empire, there is a dramatic change in the way that the state religion functioned. In the 13th century, we see Mahayana Buddhism, which is sort of an inclusive, big vehicle style of devotional Buddhism being practiced. And then, but sometime in the 13th to 15th century, we see a dramatic change to Theravada Buddhism, which has a completely different state-level implication to it. So the question is, what is happening in this switch between Mahayana to Theravada? What makes the Khmer elite decide to change their affiliation? What is the rationale for it? Because this is an issue that's plaguing not just the research questions that we're dealing with, but the people in Angkor itself. Because suddenly big temples stop being built, you see terraces being constructed, statuary specifically moves to the historical representation of the Buddha. You lose, of course, representations of bodhisattvas, and devotional activities change dramatically. So the evidence for Buddhism at Preah starts from the very beginning. The earliest inscription that we have is K161, which is from the earliest temple, which was dedicated in 1010 CE, and is a dedication that has both Shiva and Buddha's name. But Buddha's name comes first. At this point, it is quite unique for this kind of synergy to take place. But it suggests that Buddhism had an important role at the site at this time. If we move a little bit further in time into the 12th and 13th century, there's iconography that is associated with Mahayana and also Vajrayana. Vajrayana is associated with Tantric Buddhism, probably coming from connections with monks coming from Tibet. And then in the third phase, we have evidence of this Theravada. Now, the representations of Theravada are usually the association of the Buddha himself, historical Buddha, the Buddha in particular phases of his enlightenment. Here we have two of the most kind of iconic representations at Preah. This is the base of Preah, which is actually one face of a four-sided standing Buddha tower. Here you can see a bit of his hand right here. We estimate that this would have stood about 12 meters high when it was actually fully standing. Then we have graffiti on the inside of the second temple enclosure of the Buddha and the parinirvana, so as the Buddha is dying. So these are both images that suggest that there's a switch in the religious affiliation from Mahayana to Theravada. And the fact that we see graffiti indicates that there is someone actively changing the nature of the religious orientation of the site. Other evidence that we have, the Pali inscription, I put it in quotes, I'll tell you about that in a minute, which comes from Preah, which is the only real inscription that we have at the site. Many other sites have dozens of inscriptions, and we have almost none, which is a bit of a pain. Laterite terraces, as I said before, terraces become an important part of the establishment of different types of ritual architecture that was probably based on wood, not stone anymore. And then we also have this very intriguing issue of what we call the recarved lintels. There's many of these lintels above the door jambs of the temples that are deeply recessed, and the nature of the Buddha's faces is not quite on. There's some, it looks like you had a bunch of people who didn't know what they're doing, recarving them into different visages. So we've got a other instance of kind of a graffiti, of a repurposing of the site, which may all be interrelated with this post-Mahayana phase. So the main questions that I'm kind of interested in addressing are, through the Two Buddhist Towers project, is Preah a Buddhist site from its inception? Do we have this, is that first temple that has the inscription really the earliest occupation of the site, and can we find any evidence of the religious activity associated with Buddhism? Can we actually identify a change? Can we actually see this transition between Mahayana and Theravada within the site? And what role did Buddhism actually play in the city, region, and the empire, and how can this help us with our understanding of everything in Angkor? What I like about working away from Angkor is that Angkor was occupied for about 2,000 years, and it's got a palimpsest problem. Here we have a discrete 200-year temple phase, and then we have another 100 or 200 years of iron production after it, and nothing seems to have been wiped clean. So we potentially can address a lot of the questions that you can't get in Angkor. But a more important thing that we need to address is we're making an assumption that all this is Theravada, and can we actually identify Theravada occupation at the site? So we put together a team. This is a photograph from about 3 weeks ago, and these are all the different people who are involved. Multidisciplinary international team focusing on a wide range of different aspects of research. We put together an application to the Robert H. and Ho Family Foundation, which is specifically for Buddhist research, and if they have another round, I think coming up this year. It's a fantastic grant scheme. To be honest, I put my application in because most of it was Buddhologists and people who are working with text, and I didn't think we would get it, and they gave it to us, because we're trying to do a multidisciplinary Buddhist archaeology. The intersection between how this specific case of religion and sort of broader aspects of the archaeology of religion is becoming a much more dynamic and growing line of inquiry in archaeology is, what can it actually do? Why would we look at religion, and can we actually identify it? Why would you focus on the archaeology when we know that it's Buddhist? Okay? So yes, that's Theravada, that's Mahayana. But what we need to do is to try to identify the practice, right? So the practice of religion often differs from what the texts say. And this is an important thing for us to, we can't presume that the way that particular rituals are undertaken are always undertaken in that way. People do things differently in different parts of the region, different parts of the world. If you look at how studying the archaeology of religion specifically can impact the broader issues of, say, Buddhism, we can look at the this is Timothy Insol's sort of concepts of looking at the negative aspects of studying the religion is proving the existence of something. Positive ones are the ones that I think are more interesting, are identifying the unexpected, but also syncretisms, and more importantly, is there continuity? How do these things change? How does the community interact and intersect with the religion in their day-to-day life, and how does that impact the way that they're actually producing material culture, which is largely what we're left with as archaeologists. So what the Two Buddhist Towers project is attempting to do is to fuse these three aspects. We're looking at history, and history we're talking about epigraphy. We're looking at the nature of temples and its iconography, but also the people. So we want to do settlement and diet. And in order to do this, we've got a whole range of different approaches that we're trying to integrate together to try to give a more holistic picture than just looking at the evidence of the texts within the region. So if we're going to study the religion basically, initially, because we're going to focus on both the religion and the community within the rest of the talk today, is to actually focus on the visible evidence. And the two things that we thought we should look at first is Preah. So when was Preah built? This is a really critical point of that four-sided Buddhist tower. We need to know when that was built to see if it actually fits with the presumed 15th century adoption of Theravada by the state, or does this happen earlier? And then a second one that's almost more important is the nature of terraces. When people are now starting to adopt the idea that, oh, it's a terrace, oh, it's Theravada. It can't be anything else because that's where the wooden structures would have been, and this is a hallmark of Theravada architectural construction. So is that actually the case? So setting those things as our kind of hypotheses, my colleagues from the École Française d'Extrême-Orient looked back at this inscription of K888, which paleographically, so based on the nature of the curves of the text, indicate that it's probably 14th century. The initial person who translated it said that it was in Pali and Khmer. The script, just to let you know, is in Khmer, and then the actual language that it's saying is in Pali, so it's a little bit complex. The initial translator said that the actual language that's being used there is Pali. Well, it's been now retranslated, and it's actually in Sanskrit. So this was initially identified as a Theravada text, and now it appears that it's probably Mahayana instead. So by re-evaluating the text, we can see that one of the big linchpins for our Theravada argument is now kind of starting to falter. The next thing we decided to do is, well, let's get straight to the horse's mouth. We'll go and see if we can find some evidence of when Preah was excavated. So we excavated at the foot of the laterite foundation with the goal of trying to recover samples from underneath the laterite foundation. All Khmer temples have a big laterite foundation, then you put the pretty sandstone bit on top. So we excavated down, and we got a radiocarbon date that dates to the modern era. The reason why this dates to the modern era is because the looters who had been all through this area probably jumbled up everything and turned it all upside down. Unfortunately, there were no datable materials that we could find from the sediment columns that we did either, so we have no radiocarbon date for the foundation, which is a serious blow to our argument. Hopefully the whole foundation won't get too annoyed with us, but we have some other arguments that we can use that will hopefully kind of glue this all together. If you look at the face, now in this one you can see that we're at the kind of midsection of the Buddha, of his robe, there's his feet. His face is actually right over here. And someone in the 1960s found it and kind of built it back up together. And we found this photograph in an archive. Now, stylistically, if this was a 14th or 15th century face or statue, we would have expected a remarkably different form of representation. However, if you compare these two, this is actually very much like a classic Angkorian period face that you would see at the Bayon Temple, which is the 13th century, than it is something associated with the 14th or 15th. So the facial similarities kind of indicate that maybe this isn't a really later construction. The question, though, is that since we have no radiocarbon date, is this an inspiration Did someone come along later and say, we really like this style and replicate it? Or is it a contemporary construction with all the other buildings? One of the ways to test this is to actually look at the material. So Christian Fisher, who is the co-director of the Two Towers project from UCLA, is a geologist, and his specialty is looking at all the sandstone. So what we're trying to do is look at where the sandstone comes from. We haven't found the source, but we've identified and characterized the nature of the buildings themselves. And if you compare those two temples that we just looked at, the two faces, they actually appear to be made with the same sandstone. So the argument, if they were spaced in time, is that they may have been using a different sandstone. However, it appears again that they're not. So we have another kind of blow to the whole argument that this is a completely different time period and construction. So if we turn to the concept of terraces, we did find one terrace that was intact. Well, I'll call it intact because the outside walls were intact. But as you'll see in a minute, there has been a rather serious looting problem within Preah. But the area around this hadn't been damaged. So essentially we cleared around this square terrace that the locals told us was totally flat, and all these stones here used to be the upper surface. And on top of that, they said there was a Buddha. Where's the Buddha now? Probably in Bangkok. So we excavated it to determine when this was actually built and if we could find any evidence of ritualistic activity. In fact, we did. We found a foundation pot. Most temples have foundation pots that are placed to dedicate before they are completed. This is one that was whole until the worker who was cutting through the middle of the inside here actually put his axe right through it, unfortunately. But for us it was great because we could see all the dedicatory offerings inside. So there's crystals, there's lead, there's a little bit of bronze, and all of these foundation deposits have these kinds of material. So that was good. As a side note, ironically, the worker who did that told us, oh, you're never going to find anything here because I was the one who looted this back 20 years ago. And the first year we came, we dug in the middle and we found all the foundation pots. And then we dug around the side and we found the foundation pots. And if you can imagine a donut left of undisturbed material, well, this was in the donut. But he found the last one. It was quite appropriate that he found the last of the pots that he had looted 20 years ago. But we also found this. Which is a clay stamp, which is about like this. And it is actually, if you remember that triad that I showed before, a Mahayana representation that would have been used to impress clay or potentially, we did some XRF on it, there's no evidence of metal, but it fits with exactly the same kinds of metal stamps and metal objects that have been found to the northwest in Thailand at a site that is specifically Mahayana. So in this case, our terrace is Mahayana. It's not actually Theravada whatsoever. So we're facing a serious dilemma about where's Theravada in all of this picture. If we look at the other materials in the sites, just as a kind of, this is more of a show and tell, but it also points to more Mahayana than Theravada practice. We found these lovely pedestals which have these weird sort of protrusions on the top. You can see that they're finished to here, then they're unfinished on these sides. We think that there was a metal casing of a statue that was placed over top of these things. The fact that there's three probably indicates that it's another triad. So this definitely is not a Theravada thing either. We're probably talking Mahayana Buddhism. One last bit that sort of, this is again something that's kind of on the more interest sake, because the ideas that came from a Chinese emissary to Cambodia in the late 13th century named Zhao Takwon said that the temples were covered in gold or in bronze. And there are temples in Angkor that have all these lovely holes. And this is an example of the central sanctuary in Preah, which has all these lovely holes. And we thought, oh great, this is where they put the plaques. So you actually take your bronze plaque and you put it in, and the entire interior would have been the shiny bronze or gold feature. Well, we looked last year and there's nothing there. XRF, there's absolutely no traces of anything. However, on the outside, we found these holes, and here's a hook from one of them. So in fact, there's evidence of them putting bronze plaques on the outside of the site. So we've actually demonstrated that, in fact, this little bit of historical evidence is true during this Mahayana period. In addition, we also found traces of copper-based paint. So the entire thing on the outside would have, the bulk areas would have been covered with these plaques, and then the rest would have been painted. So our view of Cambodian temples would be totally different than it is today. Community. So the religious evidence doesn't really tell us much about Theravada, so we try not to get too panicked about that and try to focus on aspects of religious practice or just what's going on inside this temple. So moving inside, we're trying to identify the activities for what's going on inside this central temple complex. Last year I walked around the interior of the site and I mapped 900 looting pits. So the entire enclosure is pretty much just upside down from decades of looting. And the stuff that the locals said that they found pieces of a foot of a bronze statue this big, piece of bronze the size of a car door, they found gold, they found effigy pots, everywhere here. So it's just, it would have, 20 years ago, this would have been a veritable archaeological gold mine, but it turned out to be a gold mine anyway. What we focused on the first year was in this northeast quadrant, trying to determine whether we can find anything that's undisturbed. We put trenches down in 2 places, and we got consistently nice dates. Mid-12th and early 10th century for the lower part, and then early 11th to late 12th. But the problem is that the ceramics that we're finding in these actually are all, they're from late periods, early periods. So our first attempt at trying to find something undisturbed failed epically. We did find some botanical remains, which is an interesting part of this whole work in that we can try to reconstruct diet. One of my colleagues from University College London is a rice specialist. She's trying to work on genetics of rice to determine whether the rice is actually from India or whether it's from China at this stage. If we think about Indian Buddhism and Hinduism coming over with its various rituals, it'd be fascinating to see if we have Indian rice suddenly appearing within the region, because we know that Chinese rice was the first. But including rice, we found evidence of mung bean and weeds of cultivation associated with these kind of turned up periods. So we know that there are kind of a diverse crops that were being used. In terms of these looting pits, something that I decided to do is how do you make a looting pit work for you? All looting pits being equal, they're just looking for all the good stuff. So they'll just throw all the sherds out on the banks. So if you collect all the sherds from all the looting pits in an area from the inside to the outside and 2 meters out of it, you can get a representative sample regionally of what's actually in one location to see if there's different activities or different consumption patterns in different parts of the site. And in fact, I did 40 of these, and there's a consistent signature for the ceramics across. So everybody's kind of getting the same local stonewares, earthenwares, and also foreign Chinese ceramics. In terms of where these ceramics are coming from, Preah of Kompong Svay is here, and we have ceramics from all the major production sites. It's quite remarkable, and in large quantities. This site is getting lots of stuff. They're doing something where they're able to consume it, and what's going back out, we're not sure. I have a sneaking suspicion I know. And in addition to that, we have a large volume of pottery coming in from China. So this area, which is relatively remote compared to Angkor, has a major role to play in this broader picture. LiDAR is big in the world right now. Damien Evans has just completed the 2nd LiDAR mission over various sites in Cambodia, including Preah. And what you can see now is, this is where we excavated last year. All these little brainy bits are all the looting pits. But what you can see is the grid. And the grid structure is very important because it identifies the nature of the urban landscape inside these temple complexes where people were actually living. Examples of this, for those of you who are unfamiliar, LiDAR is essentially a laser sensor flown via helicopter and takes about 200 laser points per square meter depending on the density of the foliage, tree canopy in the area. This is the LiDAR for Angkor Wat, and you can see the same kinds of patterning. You get the little pawns and the grids. This is a similar example from Preah in Angkor. I know, Alison, you didn't find very much in the Angkor Wat excavations. Do you know if they found? I think WMF didn't find too much in Preah, did they?
We haven't really looked in Preah in Top Prom, we found a lot more than
Yeah.
Angkor Wat.
Angkor Wat. Yeah, so it's interesting to see what you find in these different areas. What we decided this year is to try and go to a place that was undisturbed. So we went to a grid block here on the northwest corner that seems to have no looting pits. In close-up, the grid block kind of looks like this. It's about 120 by 140 meters. You can see there's ponds and canals sort of bordering it on the north and south side. And what we decided to do was to put in trenches connecting the Trapeang across the causeway, and then put 2 more trenches inside the middle of it to see if we could find evidence of activity. We did. This is the best. This may seem really trivial. The images I'm going to show you are like the most mind-boggling thing I've ever found in Cambodia, because usually the sediment just looks pink. There's no change. You don't find anything, ever. There's no stratigraphy. Here we actually found a post that's from this layer here. We found post holes. And we found gobs and gobs and gobs and gobs and gobs of ceramics. These are roof tiles. The roof tiles are situated at an area which is right next to the ditch, which is in a canal, which leads into the Trapeang. So it's like the house fell over and all the roof tiles are right there. This may not look like much, but it is. This is really exciting. This area here is actually a roadbed that was created in between the canal on the edge of the site. So we have evidence of them where they walk. And as a bit of a tech segue, during our excavations this year, one of my colleagues got this wonderful software called PhotoScan. Has any of you heard of PhotoScan? Well, what you can do is you can just take photographs of things, and then you can plug it into your computer program and develop 3D models. This was taken with about 200 photographs, took about 3 hours to develop, and literally you don't have to do anything fancy, you just put them in. You can turn it sideways so you can see the stratigraphy. You can turn it axiometrically, look down it, look at your sections. It's magic. And it also makes for very interesting graphics. These are actually the lowest res quality as well. But from a pragmatic point of view, we can actually use it to show you how this all fit together. So if you think about that trench here, this is what it looks like in section. And if you put all the features, you end up with the pond on the north end. The post holes were here. We have a ditch, we have a roadway, and we have a bank with a post. For a while, we couldn't understand why things weren't actually right across in the walls. And then we realized, because we didn't align the trenches with the actual embankments themselves. Trench 7 was equally fascinating. Here's a representative from the Ministry of Culture and our Polish student that were responsible for excavating this one. This one was magic as well. You can see these dark bits here, which are pits. There's a post hole over in this corner. And there's actually 2 very distinct occupation layers. We found votive or effigy pots. This is a bit of a stoneware effigy head. Tons and tons of broken earthenware. We found little containers that were probably candles. Lots of Chinese wares. At one point, one half of the unit had crushed earthenware pottery, and the other half of it had large whole pieces of pottery, which indicates it was probably underneath the house. So it was actually quite incredible for what we found from a settlement point of view. Metals, we did find some metal objects. I think the reason why this place wasn't looted is because there was no metal there, and the looters used a metal detector when they detected stuff. So we had very little metal compared to what we would have expected in other parts of the site. This is an iron ring. Bits of iron ore, so we have both metals and the production of metals. We found 4 Chinese coins. I think 3 Chinese coins have been found ever in Angkor. And we found 4 within a 3-meter unit. So something's going on here. We also found this is a little bell that still has the dingler inside of it. Probably would have been used on cattle. But what's important about that bell is that using the XRF, these are almost the same composition. Money didn't exist in Angkor. So this is probably an example, we're still testing it, of money being actually used as a base metal to transform into something else that was useful. This one's from the Tang dynasty, the other ones are from the Song, so we're talking about 200 years before the actual occupation. In terms of community and religion, and I'm almost finished here, the one important idea pops up is that the stone there's a lot of stone production inside the site that I wasn't able to talk about. There's areas with tons of sandstone chips. They've made these very strange ritual or grinding stones. And they also have the evidence of copper production. If we go back to this pedestal here, the actual construction of this may have been something incredibly local. It's not found anywhere else in the Angkorian world where you have a metal cap over top of a stone object. So it suggests that they have access to it and they have access to the skill. So something's happening here that is different than what you get in Angkor. So in terms of what this all means, from a religious point of view, we're at a very weird thing in terms of the Mahayana Theravada transition. There's almost no evidence for conversion. There's no evidence of the 14th century. We'll see with the radiocarbon dates for this recent excavations, but the Theravada transition that we're trying to identify is really almost impossible to recognize. There is a clear continuity of Mahayana. It's possible that looting was responsible for getting rid of this upper layer, which is too bad. We'll never be able to deal with that. More importantly, it is an extremely wealthy community. The people inside of Preah I think it was like 35,000 sherds in the last 2 seasons excavated, and it's everywhere. Everywhere you go, there's stuff all over the place inside Preah. In all the temple enclosures I've been in Angkor, there's nothing like that. So there's something different going on here. They're also producing unique forms of material culture. Is this related to the Buddhist practice? Is this related to something else which is interrelated with their interpretation of state-level activities? We don't know. But what's significant about all this is that Preah seems to be more than Angkor, in that we are getting different practices, we're getting different scales of evidence, and we're getting a community situated in the middle of nowhere that is more interconnected than a lot of the other sites in the greater kind of Khmer heartland. So what's the relationship between Angkor and Preah? We're still, of course, in the early stages about this. And does this actually interrelate with the story of iron exchange that I talked about at the very beginning? Hopefully, in the next 3 years, we'll be able to interlink these two ideas. But for now, they are just ideas. Thank you very much for your time. And have any questions? I'd be most happy to answer.
Yeah.
A question on iron production.
Yes.
There were ores. Was there evidence of smelting?
Yeah, there's slag as well.
But there are very few finished products.
We found lots of iron tools.
Okay. Another question. Is this iron production sort of a linear tradition from whatever we know about from 500 BC?
I'd say that we don't know anything about iron production in 500 BC. The Iron Age in Southeast Asia, and I think this kind of goes for most places in the world, when you hit the Iron Age, iron is evident. But we never find the iron production sites, and that's the big problem, is that I think the earliest iron production site we have is 3rd century AD in Southeast Asia.
Really? But
So-
they claim that they know it.
Oh yeah, no, but that's it. And the other problem is that people haven't been looking. I am guilty of this. The first time I went to Preah, I walked right over top of a 2-meter high slag mound, and I didn't realize I just walked over one. So it's once you know that they're there, then you can start looking for them. It's like kilns. Up until 2008, we thought all the brown glazed ceramics for the entire Khmer Empire came from Thailand. And now we found them everywhere because we know what to look for. So it's one of those things that archaeology in Southeast Asia is really in its infancy in many ways. So I think we'll start to, once we start looking, we'll find them. But I think the early iron production sites will be difficult because they're probably very small. And
Can I ask one more question on iron? Since there were communication between the Khmers and the Chinese, was there any evidence of the introduction of Chinese technology? For instance, cast iron?
there's no cast iron at all in Cambodia, but there's lots of cast iron being brought into Cambodia. So one of the primary things that were brought into Cambodia from China was cast iron cooking vessels.
Yeah.
But there's some of the iron production sites that we've been studying, there's little, when you cut open some of the blooms we found, there's little bits of cast iron in it. So there's like incipient cast iron, but the process wasn't there. It's all bloomery. The question I'm trying to investigate now is the earliest iron production sites around that source of iron are the 8th, 9th century. And that's when the Angkorian Empire takes off. And my hunch, and I've got to get in touch with the people at UCL, because there's a student who's actually studying bloomery production iron in China. Because no one talks about it in China. They talk about cast iron and the significance of cast iron. But bloomery iron, you need to do it because you can't make tools out of cast iron. So the question is, was there some kind of interaction that was happening that kind of spurred the 8th, 9th century expansion of the Khmer to be able to suddenly start making iron tools in that period? And is that an introduction of technology, or is it a sort of attenuation of the pre-existing sites? So until we start identifying 3rd to 6th century iron production sites in Cambodia to get a comparison between the technologies, it's difficult to answer that, but it's really imperative that we do.
Yeah, it seems like the Khmer are a really important player here, and I'm just wondering how their oral histories and accounts for the time and the trade networks and even kind of linguistics aspects line up with the archaeological research that we do.
I've got a PhD student who's actually studying, doing a kind of ethnobotanical study with the Kui. And it's all interrelated with, its iron and wood products were really important. So there's a interesting synergy between them. The Kui today, some of them say that they're the ones who made the Khmer do what they did, that they were responsible for building the temples because they made the iron. In part, that's probably true. That I think that the ability to suddenly harness quality iron enables you to actually quarry stone. It's unfortunate that in terms of the metal production, the last of the Chai, who were the chief smelters in the Kui villages, he died a year before we got out to the village. But a French ethnographer in the 1960s actually did a 12-day jaunt through the area in Plumdyke and talked with a bunch of the existing smelters about the sort of traditions and the techniques and things that they used for the production of the iron. But what's fascinating is if you look at we've excavated a 20th century Kui furnace, and we've excavated an 8th century furnace. And we'll call it the recent Kui, the technology is totally different. The tuyères are very small, they're very narrow. So something happened, and when we've excavated and dated them subsequently, it goes back kind of the 18th century, and there's a big change. So the Angkorian period style of furnaces stop, and then the new Kui style starts. And they also change from being round to being rectangular in shape. So it's really too bad that we weren't able to go a few years earlier to get more details on the nature of kind of the more recent Kui technologies. But another key aspect of it is of course, the nature of the forest products, which I hope my PhD students will be able to address in detail.
really fascinated by the by what seems to be missing from these looted sites, and I was wondering if some of them are more recently informally excavated by like community members. If there's any way to like find them and have access to them. through
Like the
community
people themselves?
relationships. Yeah.
Yeah,
If they're in the community circulating.
Oh yeah, it's
you know.
what's last year was quite fascinating because everyone in the village who's old enough that worked for us looted. There was the only way that they could make money, but the thing is, it wasn't just them who were responsible. They talked about thousands of people from all over northern Cambodia coming to this site, and every year they would just methodically go through. And what was interesting is they were telling us about there was a Thai middleman who came down from Preah that they would sell the material to, and then they would send that on to Bangkok. But some of them actually came with some of the things that they still had. And this one guy actually brought out 12 copper-based metal plaques, and 8 of them were plain, but then the other 4 actually they were stamped with inscriptions on them. And he said, oh yeah, I bought that from a guy who ripped out the floor of this temple, and underneath it was this mandala of copper plaques that had been put there as a foundation for it. He brought those to us so that we could study them, because my French colleagues are epigraphers, so they wanted to see what they say. And essentially it just says like, the Dharma. I mean, it was very, that's all it says.
I'm also curious about the market in which these items.
Why they went to?
Yeah, like how's how are they like circulating, selling,
Bangkok.
buying them?
Bangkok to here, to Europe. If you go into any antique shop in Bangkok, you'll find lots and lots and lots. Preah has been a fountain of exporting really beautiful things since the 1860s when Delaport went there. If anyone's been to the Guimet Museum in Paris, they have this beautiful collection of Angkorian statuary, and I know where the base of the feet for the statues are, because almost all of them are from Preah. So they took them at the time in the early colonial phase. So it's the site has a long history of giving to the world in terms of this material, but in terms of being able to find where any of it is now, because most of the stuff that they were talking about, in fact, the northeastern side where we dug the first year, the reason why it's so badly looted, we think it's because it was a necropolis. So there was lots and lots of vessels, effigy vessels with lots of things inside it. The people actually even talked about getting down to a layer where they found burials with dudes with bronze epaulets and helmets and swords, which if that's the case, that'd be awesome, because that's prehistoric, that's like pre-Angkorian. So most of the things that they would have looted were kind of portable objects that we'd never be able to actually kind of trace back to this site. But the sheer volume of material that they have there is like the looting pits. I stopped counting. It was depressing how many looting pits there were there. But I guess that's kind of where it goes.
If you're interested though, there's been some work recently by our colleague Tess Davis and some other, I forget, there's like a University of Glasgow, there's a research group that's been trying to trace some of the networks of looting and the collectors and stuff going through from Cambodia into Thailand pretty much. But Bangkok is the main market where stuff gets sent over the border and then exported that way.
And a bunch of the big stuff's being sent back now, which is great. I think the last piece from Kokir is being sent back.
Yeah, in the past. Yeah, like
Yeah.
now.
Yeah, exactly. So it was 5 museums had statues from this one site that was looted in the 70s, and they, through pressure, legal pressure, etc., they all managed to get them back from the Met. And
Yeah, Cleveland,
Cleveland,
Denver.
LA.
Yeah.
So for the big stuff, because they've got photographic records, they're able to actually, track it back. And some of the statues, they actually went to the point of actually modifying the decoration to actually make it not look like it did in the photographs.
Really basic question. What are your field conditions like, given that, U.S. military has been into this region, for a long period of time. Most of my friends that do work in Vietnam have to have minesweepers and people like that coming through.
Yeah.
So you agree with that?
CMAC has been through a good portion of Preah, and I told them that I was going to work in the Central Temple enclosure. It says, oh yeah, no, it's been mined. Like,
Oh,
mined.
okay.
So, and they've gone through most of them. There's a couple areas that still have landmines along the banks. The roadways are the main ones that you have to watch out for in these areas, because those are the primary arteries for getting in and out of the site. We had CMAC come out a couple years ago, and they didn't find anything. We found like a bullet casing this year, but nothing else.
Any other questions? Well, I know we have our World Anthropology Day festivities, and Mitch will be around participating in part of that, so if you have any additional questions, please feel free to come talk to him more. But thank you very much.
Thank you.